Well, good morning, everyone. It is uh, a delight to have you here. This is, I would say, my most exciting talk of the year because it strikes close to my heart. So I hope you enjoy it too. Um, top across the top of the slide, I have some advanced nuclear reactors. That's the title of today's talk. It's a rather low-key title, but it's subtitled, "Why Should We Care?" And the answer is because we humans need more energy than intermittent renewables can give. And that is not um, a radical statement. I think more and more um, people are coming to that realization across the world. Um, there are diehards. Emery Lovins, for one, um, keeps preaching that we should forget about nuclei and just play with the atom, with the electrons. It amazes me that this guy can get away with that. But I think most people recognize that um, we've had 10 to 20 years, depending upon how you want to look at it, of tremendous support for wind and solar. And they have managed to hold, oh, no, I lost all these interruptions. So they've had their day, but we're I think gradually more and more people are recognizing that intermittent renewables are barely handling some of our increased use of electricity with artificial intelligence and many other um, uses of electricity. Um, we can barely keep up with our increased consumption with our intermittent renewables. And so we really need a stable source of energy. And it's finally getting through to the public, I think. It was the hottest year ever recorded for the planet, even hotter than expected. And this picture shows a church in Saint-Cyr. It's the northeast corner of France, pictured at sunset during a heat wave in 2023. They're expecting it to be just as hot, if not hotter, in 2024. And you could ask, well, why is nuclear overlooked? I've paid attention when I get on PBS TV and see commentaries by um, science writers and journalists who you would expect to have done some research. And they talk about energy storage, about carbon recovery, burying carbon. They talk about geothermal energy, tidal energy. They have lots, but the word nuclear doesn't come up. And I find it really quite amazing. I've written letters to some of these people. I don't even get a reply. Um, and so this is an interesting slide showing the construction of nuclear reactors that have really dropped off since 1980, which is right about here, before Chernobyl. And of course, 79 was 3 Mile Island, which happened just after the movie The China Syndrome was released and caused quite a stir in 3 Mile Island area. The purple here is American construction. These are new nuclear projects that you see here. The gray is the rest of the world, and there's a lot of people in the rest of the world besides the United States, Russia, and China. Russia being red and China being orange. China really has come into the fore since the turn of the century. But we've been remarkably absent, except for this little splurge. I would guess that they're talking about the Vodal plant in the southeastern part of this country, which took an extra 10 years to build than they thought, but at least that got finished. So that may be our tiny little bit of purple in this last decade or so. And it was just, Vodal was just running. There were for units total. Units 3 and 4 are new, and they're both now up and running. So that's good. So it shows that nuclear power really has been overlooked, partly because we haven't been doing any building. The rest of the world has, but we've been frightened off. Not quite sure why we got so frightened, but I wanted to share this with you rather than put it in some table. I'd like to use the actual wording that I got from the American Nuclear Society. They say, we let politicians get in the way regarding recycling and a repository. And let me just read this. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, called appropriately NWPA, codified our Department of Energy's responsibility for developing a repository for used nuclear fuel. 20 years later, the President and Congress approved Yucca Mountain in Nevada as a site for this repository. 8 years later, however, the Department of Energy shut down the Yucca Mountain without citing any technical or safety issues. In contrast, decades of scientific study had consistently concluded that this proposed repository could safely protect future generations. Now, by that time, in 2010, $12 billion had already been spent on Yucca Mountain, and 65,000 metric tons of fuel were in temporary storage at 39 states across the country. And the plan was to move some of those to Yucca Mountain. Now, many of us who knew the value of the, and I'll get into this in later slides, weren't too bothered by that because it might have been a little hard to get it back when we got Generation 4 reactors, which could consume this so-called waste, which is only 2% spent fuel. And so in 2014, a federal court ordered the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to complete safety and environmental reviews of the site. And they've been concluded, and they found that Yucca Mountain complies with all the regulations, and a final decision is still awaiting extensive formal hearings. Meanwhile, this inventory of waste has gone up from 65,000 to 86,000 metric tons. Now, most nuclear proponents are kind to minimize that and say, oh, that would just fill a football field with maybe 3 feet deep or 4 feet deep, whatever. Waste, that's not so bad. But the problem is that our taxpayers, all of us here, are paying billions of dollars every year for securing this storage safely. It's safe, no danger, but we're still paying for it. And meanwhile, it's going up from 65,000 metric tons to 86,000 metric tons in simply, I think it's about 15 years or so. So we haven't even started to hold it steady or reduce it. It's going up as long as we keep sitting around on it. This is highly political. As you know, probably you're aware of Barack Obama's wanting to settle any arguments with the Speaker of the House at the time, who was very active in Nevada, and they had some kind of a deal. But that's all very well, but there's some serious ramifications from some of those political dealings. From that, I wanted to come to some good news for a few minutes. This is a wonderful piece of good news. Small modular reactors, which are called SMRs for short, are expanding, and they have a project pipeline. I don't like the word pipeline. There's nothing to do with pipes, but apparently it's a popular word by this writer. Reached 22 gigawatts in the first quarter of this year, and that's an expansion of 65% in the last 3 years. That's pretty impressive. The nuclear power market has been gaining momentum as key strategy to achieving net zero, says David Brown, director of this energy transition service. While the sector has faced a range of challenges over the past year, especially the cancellation of NuScale's clean power project, multiple markets across the world are expanding their focus on nuclear small modular reactors. This is a picture to your right that you see here called BWRX-300 by General Electric working with Hitachi. It's a well known plant, and that picture is not one that's actually running. It's an architect's image, but it's proposed, I think, to be in Pickering, Ontario, just east of Toronto. And that's presumably Lake Ontario in the background.
A comment?
Yes.
This says project pipeline. Has nothing to do with construction.
Yes, I understand.
The ideas that are being put together with these companies that plan it.
Yeah, I commented on that, Stephen. Thank you. I'm aware that it has nothing to do with construction, but I think it's a bad choice of words. And that's why I said I don't like the word.
Very misleading.
It is very misleading. Yeah. It's somebody, whoever's writing that should have thought twice before choosing that word. He likes it because he's used it in the subtitle as well. Last thing we need is another pipeline. So thank you for that, Stephen. You're quite right. I wanted to point out also that about this NuScale business. It turns out that I thought up until a couple of days ago, as I was preparing this, that the utilities just sort of chickened out after they had said that they would support it. But that's not the case at all. What happened was that the NuScale is a light water reactor compressed in such a way that you do not have to have external electricity running pumps. So they use natural convection currents. In order to do that, they have to have, there's a lot of pressure here, and they have to have reinforced concrete. Well, somebody started projecting the cost of reinforced concrete, and they were using numbers that were very much out of date. And when they realized the cost, it was double. And so the utility said, oh, sorry, you've doubled your price estimates. Forget that deal. And so here was this project, the very first approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it's debatable whether that will ever be activated again, because that's very costly. And it's just one more example of somebody doing a poor job of estimating the true cost, and nuclear falling flat on its face. So that's sad. It's good that we have BWRX as a backup. And by the way, BWR stands for boiling water reactor. And the pressures there are not nearly as high as in PWR, which stands for pressurized water reactor. The temperature in the pressurized water reactors are 300 degrees centigrade, but you have to maintain quite a lot of pressure, about 17 atmospheres or more. And in boiling water reactors, they're not quite so high. And so GE Hitachi is able to move ahead, and they have a huge experience, both companies, in this sort of thing. So they didn't have so much trouble getting going. But it was a bit of a shocker. Yes, Lee.
What's the reinforced concrete made of? I mean, it's like a metal framework.
Just like you see on the roads, steel rods with concrete poured around them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Richard, can I make a comment?
Sure, Lou.
Hear me? In defense of the pipeline, yeah, it's tied to like energy, like an oil pipeline, but you have to think of it as a job, as a preparing scientists and engineers for the pipeline of the future of jobs and their training and all of that, because they come in at different points and you want to keep them in the pipeline and not lose them.
I understand perfectly, Lou, how it got to be used. I still think, considering it went out to the general public, it's a poor choice of wording. Period. Yeah, I understand.
It could be
very pejorative.
It could be.
Yeah, I understand why. I understand why it got used. Somebody should have thought twice. It's the whole idea of nuclear reactors, especially small ones, is to get rid of all these wires going across and all these pipelines. That's the last thing we want, are wires and pipelines in a vulnerable grid. So it's not.
Right. I get it. I get
Not
it.
well worded. Yeah,
Richard, can I ask a question about the boiling water reactor? So
sure.
the fact that it's boiling water rather than pressurized, does that mean that the heat conversion is much lower?
Yes, it's at 100 degrees instead of 300.
Right. So what's the advantage of that then, other than the fact that,
None.
It is, the advantage is that it's simpler to build. You do not have to have a secondary circuit of cooling water. So it's simpler to build. The disadvantage is
yeah,
that because it's only operating at about a third the temperature, that there's less conversion of heat to electricity.
yeah. All
You
right.
should also note it's less efficient than a pressurized water reactor because you have a smaller delta T.
Right. Yep.
And it also does not have the isolation of the reactor loop from the environment.
Yeah.
The entire generation is in an area that can be contaminated if you have a leak in the primary system, whereas a PWR isolates that with an intermediate loop.
Thank you. Appreciate the engineering input. By the way, I should let you folks know, most of you know already, I'm not an engineer. I'm a radiation oncologist. Along the way, I did a PhD in medical biophysics, but that didn't teach me much engineering. So I defer to my colleagues here who and appreciate their input because I'm certainly not an engineer, but I still find the decisions that have been made in the history of nuclear energy to be appallingly bad. And it just pains me to look back and see the dreadful errors and blunders that have been made over the years, some of which I went over in my review of the first nuclear era that Weinberg wrote. He was so good-natured about it. He didn't whine when he was fired because he wanted to make the system safer. So, but still, the decisions that have been made have been incredibly stupid, if I may use that word. Now, this is a slide that I made up myself, comparing small modular reactors, which is how this talk started. The problem in distinguishing it from advanced reactors that are often called Gen 4s. And this is a really important slide. If you can take a picture of it, screenshot if on your computer, because there's a lot of interesting information here that you won't find many places, I don't think. First of all, there's the output in megawatts of E stands for electricity. And in the first column, or the second column there, but the under global fleet, that means all of the reactors in the world, the vast majority of them, not all, but the vast majority of them are light water reactors or LWRs. There are roughly 436. It goes up and down as some of them from day to day, as some of them get turned off and some get turned on. But their output in general is about 1,000 megawatts. Some of them are only 500, 600. Some of them are more. If you go up to Canada, they've got 6,500 megawatts, but they have several of these CANDU reactors packed together. But those are generally how a given plant is characterized by the output of the plant. And I would say on the average, it's about 1,000 megawatts, or you could say 1,000 1-megawatt wind turbines, or there are different ways of looking at it to help you come up with a concept. The small modular reactors, which we look over in the next section, they're supposed to be under 300 megawatts, and some of them are as low as 200. There are micro reactors that are down around 50, and there's some that creep up to 400. So I just used a window there of 200 to 350. The usual is around 300. And the idea is that you can build a gang of a dozen of them or 10 of them or so, and have different ones online to tailor it to the community. So you can just build one with 3 or 4 of those, or with 10 of them. When you go over to the generation 4, these are the most advanced by far, and the output there is quite variable all over the map. So that's all I could put down was that word. Now, going down to the next line of fuel. The fuel for the global fleet of light water reactors, I say light water because I'm excluding here heavy water, and there are a fair number of those. I will get to that in the next line. But as you know, the vast majority of that is uranium-238. That's the natural isotope in the rocks. Only less than 1% of that is 235. And that's gradually decaying in the soil. We're going to have less and less of it over the millennia that follow. But we can enrich it, fortunately, because we've learned when we were trying to deal with the chain reaction, when we look back to the history of the chain reaction, we found that we had to enrich it if we wanted to get a nice chain reaction going. So then we come to the SMRs. Those are, because they're small and we don't want to have to be refueling them, the vast majority of them are written with a plan to use HALEU, or HALEU, as some people pronounce it. That is up to 20% uranium-235. And hang on. I'm busy giving a lecture, call back later. Okay, hopefully no more interruptions. So they're up to 20%, and that's sort of the limit. As you may know, for military use, bombs and such, warheads generally up to 95% 235. So this is considered an upper limit for low enrichment uranium, and it's called HA is for high assay, low enriched, and so that's a standard figure. Turns out that we don't have very much of it in stock. Most of it was in Russia or other places that we weren't trading with, and so finally the politicians realized the blunder, and we started to increase the availability of that and hope to be up to snuff when some of these small modular reactors eventually come on board. Hopefully we'll have some fuel for them by then. Now these Gen 4 ones can be either uranium or thorium, and we'll talk more about that later. The moderator is generally light water or heavy water. Heavy water, the D stands for deuterium instead of hydrogen. And then the SMRs, of course, need regular water. The vast majority of the global fleet does too, although CANDU reactors are, they were never accepted by the United States NRC, but they have been accepted by many other countries, and they've been exported to India, Pakistan, all over the Middle East, and I think as far as South America and elsewhere. So they're fairly widely distributed, mostly through the CANDU manufacturers in Canada. The graphite over here is used as a moderator, and sometimes, in addition, and we'll find out about that later, heavy water as well. This is one of the most important lines in the table, the percent that's fission. Only 2% of the global fleet of 436 light water reactors, only 2% of that is fission. The rest of it sits around. We call it waste. It's not waste. It's simply unspent fuel. Now with the SMRs, everybody thought, well, that's wonderful. They're small, compact, but what about the percent fissioning? It turns out it's a little less. So per megawatt, there's actually a little bit more waste. So there's no advantage there. But here, at least for Gen 4s, 95% of it is fission, possibly a bit more. And so that is an important, very important qualifier. Special features, Well, there's an awful lot of global expertise with these global fleet. The rest of the reactors have only been used experimentally in some labs here and there. And so we have a huge population of people, some retired, listening to this talk, who are very knowledgeable about light water reactors. We had this guy talk to us about how to drive a light water reactor over in England. He was a wonderful speaker. I think his name was Tucker. And I thoroughly enjoyed him. But when I read his book and when I talked to people here, some of whom are in our audience, they're not used to Gen 4. They are appropriately hesitant to endorse much of it. And so they tend to hold to the tried and true that they're familiar with. That's understandable. But it's a special feature of the global fleet. And what's inherent in what I just said is that there's a lack of people with expertise in the Gen 4 reactors, which is really unfortunate. Parts of the small modular reactors are mass produced. And that's, everybody jumped on this. Oh boy, we can reduce the cost. Well, we just found out that we can't because we didn't think properly about the reinforced concrete costs. So that's a loss. With the Gen 4 reactors, there are 6 different families. And by the way, I didn't mean to say that's a loss. That's a little extreme. But it's a loss for the particular NuScale, which is the only one that's been approved by NRC. But there are lots of others coming down the pike. And SMRs, I don't mean to poo-poo them. There are other ones than NuScale will be very useful in the future. For Generation 4, we've talked about those before quite a few years ago. There are 6 different families. They're described on the Rethinking Nuclear website. The molten salt reactor, I think, is the most popular for obvious reasons that we'll discuss as we move ahead.
Richard, I have a quick question.
I have a question before you move on. 2 questions, actually. So one thing, what does high assay mean in the HALO?
It just means it's higher than the 3.5%, 4% that we usually prepare when we get the uranium.
It just seems like a contradiction in terms that it's high assay, but it's
but it still fits within the bracket. Yeah, it's a contradiction in terms. You're absolutely right. It's high assay because it's more than 3 or 4%, but it's still low enriched because much lower than 95.
Thank you. So let me just ask one other question here about these advanced reactors. Is this just my impression, but is there actually anything new in nuclear reactors that hasn't been invented like in the 40s and 50s? In any of these advanced reactors?
Yeah, Stephen correctly said no. The whole idea of the molten salt reactor was developed by Oak Ridge in response to a ridiculous request by the Army and I guess maybe the Air Force, to make flying nuclear reactors that would stay aloft for days at a time. And can you imagine anything so ridiculous? So the Oak Ridge people realized that this was crazy. They refused to do such a crazy thing. And then the Army came back with apparently reinforced by the president. I don't know if Nixon was the guy at the time, but anyway, there's huge political pressure put on Oak Ridge. They were ordered to do it, whether they thought it was reasonable or not. So largely Weinberg and his people designed the molten salt reactor because it was the only feasible thing that was efficient enough that maybe it would fly someday. And I have pictures taken. I took some of them myself. I visited the museum there at EBR-1 in Idaho, and it's an incredible piece of machinery. I don't know how you'd ever fit it in a plane, let alone have it far enough away from the occupants of the airplane who would get a lot of radiation unless it were heavily shielded. So it was a ridiculous idea, but that prompt did get Weinberg and his people thinking about ways to make it simpler. And we have to credit the silly military.
I have a question.
Wait, let me just finish this. So
Sure.
Even if we just look at Bill Gates's TerraPower, so they're proposing natrium.
Sodium.
What is it called, right? It's a sodium cooled reactor.
Yeah.
I mean, that itself comes from the 40s and 50s too, right?
That's
So
right.
No.
Are there
No, so-
any actual new ideas in fission reactors that haven't come out of the 40s and 50s? Is the answer really no?
I think the engineering is different.
Or the engineering?
You can't run SMRs without having corrosion resistance in your system. All that's been worked
corrosion,
out.
Lou, hang on. I'm going to talk about corrosion later. I don't want to get into it now.
Yeah, that's fine.
And it turns out the corrosion is a myth, total myth. It's been going on for 20 years. I'll tell you about it later. Hang on.
Okay, I have a different question though.
Yeah, okay.
So Joseph, did your question get answered?
I'll try one more time. Are there any new ideas in fission reactors that hasn't come out of the 40s and 50s? Other than the engineering, I can understand how the engineering gets improved, but I just want to know if current advanced ideas on fission reactors, are they simply just new ways of doing old ideas that were, basically 70 years old or something already?
Basically, I would answer in the affirmative. If you read The First Nuclear Era, and if you'd like, I'll lend you that book because it costs about $40 to buy it on the market, unless you can get a secondhand one. But he said there are at least 10,000 different ways to build a nuclear reactor. There are so many permutations and combinations, and they thought of a lot of them at Oak Ridge, and most of it never got published, or if it did, it just got published in some reports. And but so there has been an enormous amount of effort in finding the idealized one, and Weinberg eventually thought of it as compared with Mozart composing one of his operas or something like that, because it was very intricate thinking, and they didn't do it as fast as Mozart. But I would say to your answer is mostly yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I'll get to mine and shut up. Breeder reactors, where do they fall? Breeder reactors, and how old are they?
They are
They're just as old.
Yes, just as old. They're basically, well, we'll get into them later, but they're basically much easier than thorium. Yeah,
we built breeder reactors at Hanford to get the enriched uranium for the bombs.
Yeah, not only that, but
not plutonium, just uranium.
Plutonium is an end product. Yeah, we used thorium in the very first reactor that was ordered by Eisenhower. It was in Pennsylvania. I'm forgetting momentarily the name of the reactor.
Shippingport.
Thank you, Shippingport. By the time they came around to refueling it for the third time, they put in some thorium along with the uranium, and they did a special test, and a year or two or three later, they measured the amount of radioactivity coming out of it. And sure enough, they'd had a breeder reactor that whole time. They ended up making enough plutonium and that they had a breeder reactor. The thorium helped that go along. There's a lot of natural recycling.
Right. Cool. So you would say the breeder is more of a Gen 4 or not?
Yes, a Gen 4. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This is a book, this on the left came just published. You can't see it, but I'll show it during the question period. But this left panel, New Nuclear is Hot, really red hot, so on. This is by Robert Hargraves. He's spoken to us twice. He's a professor at Dartmouth University. And if you want an inexpensive softcover summary of everything there is to know in 165 pages, that's a really good book. He's a good teacher, and he's very good at putting together books. So I just mentioned molten salt reactors are hotter because they generally run at about 500 to 700 degrees, and they're safer due to the lower pressure. So that's the key thing that I showed you in that earlier slide. This is a picture from the Copenhagen Atomics reactor, which we'll see later. So, oh boy. So, John, I'm giving a lecture. Call you back later. Bye. I tell you, calls. Okay. As the molten salt heats up, it expands. Now the pluses and minuses here are not charges. These are just different signs for different atoms and dissolved in the molten salt, which is generally a lithium fluoride. And the point is that everybody's used to thinking of the solid in the water, but once you dissolve the fuel into a molten salt, it's a very natural thing. As the temperature goes up, the particles get a little more agitated and they move apart. As soon as they move apart, the energy falls off with the square of the distance. And so you have a natural cooling effect with increased temperature. And this is a remarkable, there are other safety things built into the light water reactor, don't get me wrong, but the liquid nature, plus they have a frozen plug at the bottom. So if you lose power, the frozen plug melts and all of this goes into a cistern that is designed to contain it safely away from the reactor. So there are all kinds of safety features built into the molten salt reactors that people sometimes ignore, but it's a wonderful feature. Okay, now here is a remarkable map provided by, I've forgotten, I think it was the American Nuclear Society. The source comes from a talk called Advances in Small Modular Reactors. And look at all these reactors. There are 87 of them. I counted. Nuclear power plants are now on paper. Notice I didn't say now operating, just on paper. And I'm going to talk about some of them in Canada, about half of them in the United States, and some in Europe. I'm going to let these go because they're just too much, and I don't want to bore you with stuff going on in China and Japan and in Korea. But there's some in South Africa, one in Argentina, and so on. But the majority of them, of course, are in Western world, Western Europe, and North America. And we'll touch on those.
They miss Brazil.
Yeah. Tell us about Brazil. What's going on there?
There's a PWR in Brazil.
Okay.
Westinghouse.
But it might not be a small modular.
No.
Okay, that's why they missed Brazil.
Okay.
Yeah, these are small modulars. So there are a lot of them. I mean, this one that we've been talking about, new scale, is called, I guess it's Voyager, VOYGR. And that's the one that was approved, the one and only in the United States that's been approved by the NRC. And this one is coming right along behind it now in both the United States and Canada because it's made by GE Hitachi. But there are lots of them. And on paper, it takes a lot to go from there. So these are just some small Canadian reactors, and I've just showing them to you so you get an idea. One called StarCore, high temperature, gas cooled, designed in Montreal. Haven't heard much about it. This one is much more well known. They put an I in front because they call it integral or integrated molten salt reactor. That they plan would generate 190 megawatts. It's made by Terrestrial Energy in Oakville, Ontario. They're interesting and ready to go, but I haven't heard of anything even from our guest speaker a few weeks ago about how it's doing. Then there's ARC 100, I'm sorry. This is a sodium moderated small modular reactor, and they want to use it to produce hydrogen and steel for new industries in the region. New Brunswick does not have a very good history. I've forgotten the name of the town, but they have not kept a very tidy facility, and they've got a bad reputation. So I'm not sure how far this will go, but maybe they'll clean up things. And then there's the SSRW, stands for Stable Salt Reactor, and that's made by Holtex. Holtex is a very big international corporation. They're expert at taking reactors down, and they're also have a very active design group that are planning on building small reactors to replace the coal plants So they have quite a reputation, good reputation. Here's some small American reactors. Here's the Voyager by NuScale in Oregon. It was the first to be licensed, but doubling of the concrete costs hurt their plans. They're planning on laying off 154 workers this year. Really a sad story of poor planning. Here's the other one that I showed you the picture of, the BWRX by GE Hitachi.
I don't see that. There we go.
Pardon?
I didn't see this slide come up.
Oh, okay. Glad you have it now. Darlington has ordered 4 of these reactors on Lake Ontario. That's nice. Here's Holtex again. They've got the 160 small modular reactor. 2 units are going to be built for Palisades in Michigan, and that's exciting news. That's been shut down, and hopefully those 2 small modular reactors will clean up things a little bit in Michigan. Westinghouse has one. They've got a tremendous history. They say this is the most advanced of all SMRs. Of course, they're going to say that. Maybe it's true. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Hermes project. This is supported by the Department of Energy and Kairos, and they've got some work going on at Oak Ridge. Natrium, we talked about already this morning, founded by Bill Gates way back, almost a quarter of a century ago. Russia delayed the HALEU delivery, and so they also China interfered with their interest in a molten salt reactor. So Bill Gates had 2 ideas in mind. One of them got thoroughly squelched. The other one just delayed. This Natrium plant will begin construction in 3 months. They've got $3 billion in support, about 2/3 of it public from the government, I think, and 1/3 from private. $1 billion, a lot of money to raise privately. So that's nice that that's going on. Thorcon, that's a company founded by, of all people, my hero, Robert Hargrave, that I mentioned from Johns Hopkins. And they have a 500 megawatt molten salt reactor built in a shipyard. And they plan to tow that to location. They were already working on interactions with Indonesia, and Indonesia is quite interested. And the details of the signing and who signed what, I'm not sure of, but they seem to be making steady progress. EM squared is kind of a cute title. Sounds like Einstein. Stands for Energy Multiplier Module by General Atomic, and also a French large company, Framatome. XE100 is in Rockville, and they'll use high temperature pebble bed reactors. I should mention the pebble bed. We've talked about them before. They're little grains in a pebble, and then many pebbles are good sized pebbles. They're the size of a golf ball. The grains, of course, are tiny. And this is in a special coating that protects them and seals them in. It's a ceramic coating, and it's nice because you don't have to do anything but monitor it. It's you just leave it alone, like Tucker did with his light water reactors. The only problem is that when they get down to a certain level of radioactivity, you just ship them off to the company, and that sounds like, well, fine, let the company deal with it. But the problem is it takes time, money, and energy to recycle the radioactive material in those pebbles. I have never yet seen anyone seriously discuss the amount of energy, time, and cost of that procedure. They just seem to think like it goes off to heaven or hell, depending upon your point of view, with the heat, and recycle it. But there's not much described, and I'm not very happy about that. This is from a topic that I attended by the Idaho National Laboratory. And you can see the state where this went on in shadow, and you can see there's a lot of things going on in Idaho. This Hermes reactor, I'll show you where that is in a few minutes. Here we are with Idaho, but you notice the title is, notice these are demo plants. They're not commercial plants. They might start to get commercial as you go over to New Jersey here, Holtec has an SMR 160, Natrium, of course, out in Washington State, and XE 100 is in Texas. Most of the rest of this is all happening at the Idaho, and most of this is all demonstration plants. And so it makes it look kind of good. You say, oh, all this stuff is happening, but it's half a decade away before things really might start getting commercial. So it's not perhaps as fast as we'd like to see. This is an example of Keros. They're all over the place. They're in California, Albuquerque, Oak Ridge. They're in South Carolina, it looks like, licensing in Ohio and up in New York State. So, so this is all planning, but we're a ways away from actually producing plants. The other thing that disturbed me a little bit when I was listening to them, they talked about these coated particles called TRISO, and then they talk about using liquid fluoride salt coolant. And I don't know why I can't imagine why you'd need to use both simultaneously. Maybe they're using some reactors with molten salt, and maybe some are in TRISO, but they didn't distinguish clearly between the two. So I found the talk rather confusing. And I'm sorry to confuse you as well, but there's these demonstration plants. We need to learn a lot more about them, and hopefully they'll come out with something useful. But I don't see that these two modalities need to be used together. Just touching on Europe, Rolls-Royce put out some really interesting looking reactors 4 or 5 years ago. When I was talking with Ryan Pickering, who's joined our Rethinking Nuclear group, he presented some community nuclear power data, which I'll show you in a minute. And he was over in the UK, and he said, well, Rolls-Royce is still thinking about it, but it seems that this community nuclear power is moving ahead more quickly. There were a couple of companies in France, Neward, this is a large company in France, Électricité de France, and they will create from old pressurized water reactors a new small modular reactor, hopefully more efficiently than NuScale did. And Jimmy Energy, funny name, they will industrialize their micro received reactors in a couple of years. So that's a little ways away. I have a Dutch friend, and I asked him to research this group. It's called Thorizon, and they've received 10 million euros from France to develop a molten salt technology that will fission waste specifically and using thorium fuel. So that's interesting. I'd like to see how that group goes. Then Sweden has a reactor, lead moderated in this case, and then STAR, which stands for Safe Tiny Atomic Reactor. It's considered by some people to be the safest and smallest reactor in the world, available for private and public ownership. That's intriguing. Wouldn't you want to have one of those in your backyard? And then Denmark, we're going to talk at some length about Copenhagen Atomics. I mentioned that last November. I showed you a few slides, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail with that one. This is some data from Ryan Pickering, who presented to us. And I thought it was interesting because it shows the long-term project cash flows. What you have here are the development costs, way back there. And then you have in light blue, the capital expenditures to build the unit. And then you have the operating costs coming up here in green. And then in white, you have the interest costs. Of course, you're going to build up some interest as you're building the plant. But boy, the interest costs get paid off within a matter of, it looks like 6 years maybe or something like that. Year 2026, okay, 26 years, that's reasonable to be paying back the interest. But the revenue keeps on going up. So if your plant, and many of these plants do have a plan to be in business for 76 to 80 years here, that's a pretty good investment, especially once you finish off your interest costs. Your revenue is pretty good, in your operating costs do increase a little bit, but nowhere near the revenue. So that was an interesting projection by Ryan. He's joined our group, Friends of Fission, and we're glad to have his input because he's a young, dynamic guy who brings a lot of information to us, and that's nice. People say, well, SMRs haven't been built yet. Actually, they have. Russia's been building them for 4 years, and there's one very famous one, this Lemotov one. This was built in blocking on the name, major city in Russia, on a seaport, and they have 2 of KLT-40s, so it provides 70 megawatts for 20,000 homes. They towed it over the top of Europe and Asia, and it's now, I've shown you pictures of this before, but it's now in the Arctic Circle, the only floating reactor in the Arctic Circle, and been working there for 4 years. So we just don't hear about these things anymore. I'd like to bring you along with me on a talk that was given by Thomas Jam Peterson, who's the CEO of Copenhagen Atomics. And this was one of his early slides. He says, if you ask the common man on the street in Europe, they will tell you the nuclear energy has some problems. But what if this is not actually true? Or what if these problems could be solved? Obvious problems of cost, delays, danger, and waste. He said, would most people prefer nuclear power because it has no CO2 emissions? He thinks perhaps by changing to a new type of reactor and using thorium as fuel, these problems almost vanish. Now, I have some concerns about Tom. I call him, his middle name is Jam, which I find kind of amusing. And so I don't confuse him with other Toms by calling him Tom. When I make notes to myself, I call him Jam. And I got into some emails with him, and we didn't do very well because he was very upset that I was concerned about climate change. He thinks that's irrelevant. He just wants to make money and be prosperous. He thinks climate change is way built out of proportion. So we have major disagreement there. But I don't know how a guy smart enough to do all this stuff on an engineering scale isn't smart enough to recognize that climate change is real. But he seems to be bothered by it. So anyway, this is one of his slides, and it's a perfectly good slide. We've seen this sort of slide before, talking about the death rate from accidents and air pollution. I think it could be a lot worse than this for coal, but anyway, he's measured deaths per terawatt hour of electricity production, and those are the numbers. So it isn't really so dangerous when the public is informed. I find this slide a little more interesting, the energy density of thorium. This is real, Einstein's equation, and this is roughly the size of the amount of energy in kilowatt hours that you get from 1 kilogram of thorium. So 1 kilogram you can hold in your hand, and that's a lot of kilowatt hours, 1 million times more than you get with fossil fuels. But if you talk to anybody out in California, and a remarkably large number of people here in Madison, they say, well, you know, if you can't get it from fossil fuels, just put up some wind turbines and some solar panels, don't realizing that the efficiency of those is roughly 1,000-fold less. So they're going in the wrong direction and ignoring totally the right direction. They don't even mention it, and I just can't get over the lack of public awareness and perhaps the concern over safety. This is another perspective to give you some numbers from Jam's lecture. He shows 1 kilogram of uranium, this is the enriched 235, giving 24 million kilowatt hours. And here's a train load of coal, 2.7 million kilograms instead of 1, giving you the same amount. So he says, to give you some numbers, 1 kilogram of coal produces about 8 kilowatts of energy, whereas 1 kilogram of uranium up here gives you 24 million. So this is a dramatic difference, and yet we are doing this in Wisconsin, hauling our train loads of coal all the way from Montana and other parts west. We continue to do this 20 years after we knew better, and still doing it today, and talking about putting up solar panels and wind turbines. We're not in Wind Alley, so we have to have these long grid wires crossing us from Minnesota and Iowa. It really doesn't make much sense to me. This single ball of thorium metal can provide you with all the energy you need for your entire life. We believe the future for nuclear, says Jam, because mass manufacturing of small reactors with extensive quality checks is a good way to go. And he thinks he'll be able to make more than one reactor per day. This is a pretty amazing statement. We take 10 to 20 years to build a reactor. Korea's got it down fine. We say it takes them 5 years, and we salute Korea, South Korea. But this guy is talking about doing one reactor per day. That's a pretty remarkable statement. I don't know if he can come near it, but even one a year would be a big improvement. Then he makes some interesting remarks about thorium. He said, thorium is the only element that allows for a breeder reactor in a thermal spectrum. And we know some of that from remarks that we've already made about Pennsylvania. This means that the power output per kilogram of fissile inventory can beat any other reactor. Jam is a great guy for saying that it's the greatest game in town and that it's a game changer is a word he likes to use. He's given a lot of talks, and I guess he gets hooked on some phrases. But this is interesting too. He says normal industry scales up the size of power plants in order to reduce cost, but this also increases financial risk significantly. We've certainly seen this in the history of nuclear plants, some of which had to be canceled partway through. Financial risks is what drives the cost of nuclear. Our molten salt reactors are small and modular, allowing them to be produced at a fraction of the cost of traditional. So any desired output is then achieved by placing multiple reactors on site. Good sound remark.
Can I ask a question about this? Because this is, if you go back to the previous slide, because this is the thing that confuses me a little bit. Maybe you can explain this to me better. So if you have, and tell me if I'm wrong or what part I'm wrong in. If you have uranium, for example, for fission to occur, you want the neutron to be in the thermal range. That's correct, yeah? But if you want neutron capture, then the cross section for neutron capture peaks at the high energies. So which is why you have a fast breeder reactor, for example. So my question is, so is this true in thorium that, as opposed to uranium, that you want a breeder in the thermal spectrum? You want the neutron to be in the thermal spectrum as opposed to uranium, where you want the neutron to be in high energy. Is that correct?
What the thorium people are impressed about is that you can do this thermally without increasing the pressure, and you have a much safer reactor. I'm sorry. I thought it had to do with the cross section for capture, for example. So isn't that why you want low energy for fission for uranium and high energy for neutron capture? Isn't that the reason? Well, you're bringing in the old technology of uranium and why we have a moderator like water.
Right.
If we didn't have water around, if we had some other moderator like graphite, then you would have neutrons more captured by 238, and you'd have more plutonium made. But in terms of safety, Wigner and Weinberg decided that light water was better. You'd be dealing in the thermal spectrum. You'd be slowing down with the water. It would be less efficient, perhaps, for making plutonium, but you'd have a very safe system. But that's a different story. Thorium gets around that story entirely by saying, look, we're not making weapons here. If we make some plutonium, that's fine because it makes it a breeder, but we're not after plutonium per se. It actually is less efficient at making plutonium than uranium is. And so we just want to keep everything in the thermal spectrum for safety, period.
So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I find this very intriguing, this whole question. And I don't understand cross-section versus capture versus this versus that. It's all over my head.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
well,
frankly,
I just want to come back to this some point. So I guess I've never seen a plot of what the cross section looks like as a function of energy. So is it fairly peaked, for example, that you would want?
there are two peaks. Let me make a note to send you
Yeah,
some of those, Joe, and I will do that.
yeah, because I never quite understood the point,
You know,
which is
this is, I'm not an engineer, and this isn't the best place to get into the deep technicalities, but I will put a note. Joe
yeah,
wants spectrum, okay?
yeah. I mean, I think it would be
Spectrum.
interesting for me to understand this better because my faulty understanding of this was that the cross section for neutron capture peaks at the high energies, the fission peaks at the low energies, but maybe that's incorrect. Maybe so you're bringing in the safety issues. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about where the cross section peaks, for example.
Yeah,
That
there
was
are
my
peaks.
understanding of it.
There are peaks up in the high energy spectrum that are more powerful than the ones in the low, but there's so much energy there that you have the choice of using either one if you're working with uranium. But thorium, I haven't looked carefully at the thorium peak, but I think if I have that, I'll send it around. What I'll be able to send you is the uranium one. I'll have to dig around. Give me a few days.
Yeah, no, that's not a problem.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. This is just the fission of thorium that leads to U-233. So thorium starts down here, and it goes up to very quickly. It converts to thorium-233, hit by a slow neutron, quickly converts to protactinium, which is a short-lived intermediate. After 30 days or so, it goes to uranium-233, and that has a totally different disintegration pathway than 235. And but you get a slow neutron, but it fissions with a high probability, gives off 2 1/3 neutrons on the average, and makes the chain reaction possible. Copenhagen will use heavy water as their moderator here. So that's just all I'm getting into here, because we're already 1 hour into our talk, and I welcome the questions. They're interesting questions, but let's move on a little bit. It's going to be pretty easy from here on, pretty easy. They've Jam has likened his plant to building a house. I thought it was kind of interesting. He's got all these different stages. Some of them are 11 years, most of them are 4 or 3 or 4. And he talks about building a house and which one of them are done. This one is 95% done, the technology foundation, and it gets down here. The whole idea he wants to get across is that in most places, particularly the United States, we're waiting and waiting for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so we get stuck in this technology thing, and we spend all our time. Meanwhile, if the NRC delays things, we run out of money and fold. And whereas he's able to move ahead, he doesn't have the NRC to deal with. And so he builds a non-radioactive prototype reactor, and he's been busy doing that the last 4 years. And then he's going to next year build a 1 megawatt, not 100 megawatt or 1,000 megawatt, but just 1 megawatt test reactor. And I'm not sure if he's going to be able to do that in Copenhagen. He might have to move out of the country for that. He's still negotiating that, I think. Then he wants to go and start planning ahead for a first commercial reactor, and then an assembly line, and to show you pictures of that. Whether he ever gets there or not, I don't know, but I'm intrigued by this fellow because even though he's a little weird in rejecting climate change, he seems to have an idea for keeping his company afloat. And you'll see a picture of it here. This is a pretty impressive bunch of people, 75 staff and growing. He's got some income from a variety of things he's doing outside of making reactors that are related to it. He's making some first-class pumps that don't need to be rebuilt often. The output of the of some of his preliminary ones would be thermal 100 megawatts. Temperature of his system would be 560 using heavy water. His target price is $20 per megawatt hour. That's a nice low figure. We'll touch on that later. His first reactor will only produce 1 megawatt sometime next year, he's hoping. But this is an interesting photograph. They're all dressed in these black outfits, and on the back it talks about energy is prosperity. Last time I showed you a hand with 3 fingers. He's expanded the hand to 4 fingers and a thumb here, talking about these 5 big points. He says it's green electricity at prices below any other energy technology. He says our waste burner can get 10 times more energy out of discarded fuel from classic reactors. He says 10 times more, but he doesn't say then what. I think he means then other reactors, but he doesn't quite say that, out of discarded fuel. We build, own, and operate reactors. This is the same as Rosatom in Russia. They build, they own, and they operate. And that helps smaller Western countries who haven't, Western Europe countries who haven't got that expertise yet. He says we're already building the first prototype in Copenhagen. His long-term goal of having green energy to 1 billion people, that's pretty long-term. He makes a comment about classic nuclear over here on the far right. Uses 235, and we could run out of it in 200 years' time. It's amazing. I didn't realize it was that close. Anyway, he says thorium can make breeder reactors, which makes them much more efficient. We'll run out of materials to build wind and solar long before we run out of thorium. So he says, therefore, Copenhagen atomic reactors are considered uber renewable energy. That was kind of cute. So this is important. We've been talking about this myth of corrosion in molten salt. 2,000 hours in purified and unpurified fluorinated lithium, sodium, potassium salt at 600 degrees centigrade. Here is the raw unpurified salt. And when he uses it in ways that would be used in a reactor, it goes to this, not so good. But when he purified the salt properly, he gets this, very low corrosion rate. Well, that was fine, but I just read yesterday, and let me read to you this. At the MIT of all places, their approach was to use accelerated protons to mimic the impact of neutrons. You don't want to use neutrons in a test facility in the middle of the university. That would be dangerous. And protons are very much like neutrons, but they have they're making proton accelerators. In fact, we're buying one at the UW hospital for treating cancer patients. So proton generators are not hard to find, and not too hard. And what they've done, 2 guys called Short and Zhu. Zhu is a Chinese name, Z-H-O-U. They find their results encouraging. In a nuclear reactor made out of good alloys, good as in quotes, the slowdown in corrosion will probably even more pronounced than what they observed in their proton-based experiments. Basically, they said if an alloy consists mostly of atoms that do not dissolve in molten salt, irradiation will cause them to form a protective coating that slows the corrosion process. Only if you have an alloy that consists mostly of atoms that dissolve in salt, then the irradiation will make them dissolve faster. And nobody took for real the results of Oak Ridge. They said, oh, well, they didn't get corrosion, but we don't believe it. We think it corrodes like the Dickens. And along comes Jam, and he says it too. And nobody believes him, but I think MIT will be believed. I think it's pretty impressive. So Jam gets a little sarcastic here, and he says sometimes the obvious has to be restated. You take a pair of iron scissors in the presence of oxygen and moisture, and you got rust, but you get rid of the oxygen. And even in the presence of water, you don't have much rust, but I think they get rid of the water as well. So he not only, by the way, he said, purifying that salt was not easy. It took a lot of work to get all of the impurities out of it.
Can I say something in here just for a second?
Yeah.
Those big solar passive facilities that use mirrors that would beam the energy up to a molten salt vessel and then send it down to make steam. Those things, their valves and their pumps did not, that's why they didn't succeed.
I
They
wouldn't,
were corroded.
yeah,
They
I
didn't
understand, but
succeed
that was,
partially because of that.
well, that was oil. There were a lot of things in there. I don't think they excluded the oxygen. I don't think you can draw any conclusions from that, Lou.
Well, I'm just saying maybe maybe that created a lot of
Yeah.
question marks about corrosion from that. But
Well, it's a
maybe
very,
this guy's got it solved. It sounds
yeah,
like he has it solved.
yeah, I'll take MIT anytime over concentrated solar.
Alan's just got one little comment on anti-corrosive metals is
Sure.
marine grade, and I don't know the formula for it, but marine grade aluminum is highly resistant to sea salt. And I don't know if this would apply to the molten salt reactors or not, but you can go out and sail around the ocean, the world many times in a unpainted aluminum sailboat and have no serious corrosion problems.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Thank you for that. No, they're talking about steel and they're talking about using nickel and sometimes molybdenum, but mostly nickel, possibly some copper. But they're talking about those elements. Yeah, your point about aluminum is well taken. With an amphibian aircraft, I was very sensitive to aluminum corrosion. I noticed that the Australian crew builders who landed, they didn't have that many lakes. I'm sorry, not Australia, New Zealand. They didn't have that many lakes in New Zealand, so they had to keep landing in the ocean. And your point is well taken, Alan. Their aluminum didn't degrade at all, but their steel really went to pot.
Yeah, and also, and it probably depend on the situation and the pressures, but you also have carbon fiber graphic composites that are stronger than steel in some situations and have virtually no corrosion properties whatsoever. So, you know, make it extra strong. You know, I don't think that area has been explored at all.
You're absolutely right. And I'll get to in a few minutes to pictures of their reactor. They've tried various metals and found that they could do far better with various fiberglass epoxy combinations. They did not do it all well with certain metals in their work. So they're still working on that. This is their iron core. And basically the purple that you see here is the fuel salt. That is a lithium fluoride in this purple, and it comes from above and percolates down. Inside here you have heavy water, and you also have on the yellow you have a blanket of salt, lithium fluoride, and at 600 degrees. So I don't fully understand this. They say the core has 1,200 liters of heavy water, but they can reuse that. They don't have to keep buying that all the time. 200 liters of fuel salt. That means thorium in fluoride, and 2,000 liters of thorium blanket salt out here. And maybe that can be recirculated. I'm not sure the details of the relationships here. It's just part of his talk, but I didn't get it all, but I just show you for what it's worth. This is a little more refined picture of how the molten salt reactors could be much better than the current one. They've got a nitrate salt, coolant salt, fluoride coolant salt, heat exchangers, and so on. Whereas over here, you have, I think this is a more, where the heavy water comes in. And, but I'm not sure how this drawing shows them so much better per se. But anyways, that's his slide, and I apologize for not knowing more about it. What these slides, I think I showed you last November, but I think they're kind of interesting. Each compares in terms of EROI, energy return on investment, for the light water reactor, and compares that with what he calls the waste burner, the liquid thorium molten salt reactor, and he's got a greater than tenfold difference here, much greater. Then he likens the waste burner to a jet airplane versus a uranium molten salt reactor versus a uranium light water reactor, and he talks about the cost of mining or the need for it, greatly reduced. Fuel production, no enrichment needed. Waste storage, 300 years as opposed to 100,000, because you get rid of most of the nuclides and all you have are the fission products, which don't need to be stored so long. I think that's more or less true, but you still have some plutonium around. So ultimately you are going to need to store to use some storage. Energy price, he feels he can get tenfold below the light water reactor. Deployment speed, he thinks he can do that in 100 times less. And the maximum pressure, 1 bar versus 200 bars. So those are his slides from last November that I showed you. I wanted to just I get his newsletter, and these are edited down, but I thought reading this one might be worthwhile. Many people claim that enriched uranium is cheap and it's not worth spending any time trying to save on fuel. He said this isn't entirely true. What is true is that classic nuclear reactors are extremely expensive on paperwork, on the construction, and therefore in capital cost. Also, classic LWR reactors use uranium extremely inefficiently. 5% enriched uranium currently costs $4,500 per kilo. You can only burn a few percent of that in a solid fuel reactor. Next paragraph, in comparison, thorium costs about $50 per kilogram instead of 4,500. And in a Copenhagen Atomics waste burner, you should be able to fission, he says, over 95% of that thorium. This gives you at least 20 times more energy output per kilogram. That is thorium versus enriched uranium. But in US dollars, it gives you take the $450 per kilo, multiply it by 20, because you're getting 20 times more energy, divide by 50 the cost of the thorium, and you get 1,800 times more energy per US dollar from thorium. So that's his. Now this, notice, is the fuel cost. We're not talking about cost for making so many kilowatts. This is in another set of slides in charts by a guy called Eric Townsend. He visited JAM. He went to Copenhagen and walked through his plant with him, and he came up with these tables. I'm putting them here for what they're worth. He has not shown any analysis on how he gets these numbers, but he shows natural gas, $920 per kilowatt, wind, a bit more, solar, a bit more. And then he shows nuclear in general, way too high. No wonder we're not using many nuclear plants at the present time, these light water reactors. They're doing very well now because they've been paid off, as I showed you in those slides, after the loans have been paid. But so they're very profitable now. But to build a new one is tricky, even though they last 4 times longer. On this slide, he shows the same numbers for natural gas, wind, and solar. But look at this. He's brought this down a factor of 10 with small modular reactors. I wish I knew how he had developed that slide. Somebody else came up with this one. Conventional nuclear, he says, costs too much and takes too long. Comparing conventional nuclear with coal and gas, and then comparing that with advanced nuclear. And he comes up with a levelized cost of electricity here with conventional nuclear at 50 to 150 per megawatt. Definitely higher than coal and gas, but he thinks that the advanced can come down to 20. Time to build, unfortunately, is 7 years or more. Korea has gotten it down less than that. We build our coal plants 3 to 5 years, and this guy must have visited JAM because he says less than a year, although JAM builds them in a day. So he says. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting slide to deal with the cost. Also, another slide was SMR-based gigawatt power plant. This is the kind of power plant I'll show you in a few minutes. But basically, he's projecting a couple of years for rapid construction in less than a year to make ready-made reactors in shipping containers. And conventional plants, they have 7 to 10 year construction period and a completion window way over here. If we started to plan a conventional nuclear plant today. So it does make us want to think about, we're certainly not going to embark on these plans, I don't think, anymore, even after we finally made it with Vodal. It was a long delay. And there are other examples around the world of similar delays. So I think that we will be at least strongly considering thorium molten salt reactors. They point out that it is not just the reactor per se. These are kind of steam turbines that are used today at nuclear plants and coal plants. They say that they need to get the cost down with lighter and more efficient CO2 turbines. I don't know anything much about this. I'm sure some of you people listening in know more than I, but they're mentioning this as something that should always be factored in. And so Jim's view again is spent nuclear fuel is worth more than gold. So if we put it deep underground, we'd be digging it up again within the next 100 years. Classic nuclear reactors have terrible fuel economy, using less than 1% of the uranium that's mined out of the ground. New reactor types like Copenhagen Atomics need 100 times less mining than all classic reactors for the same energy output. He says it's not easy or very economical to use spent nuclear fuel in classic reactors. But if you separate the spent fuel in a chemical process first, and then use those transuranics in the waste burner, you will get the highest efficiency of any reactor design. And that will, purple print there will lead us to some of his comments. This is his plan for recycling. We don't have any plans here significantly to recycle. Most of the other countries in the world, advanced countries that are using nuclear, have recycled. We decided it's too expensive. We overlooked it. We kicked the can down the road, as we so often do. But this is what they plan to do. They plan to harvest 95% of the uranium and ship it to the global market, because there's quite a market with other countries that will have their Gen 4 reactors while we sit and dither. And then the other 5%, they will store some of the fission products, because after 300 years, it'll be relatively safe. The transuranics and plutonium obviously need to be stored longer, or they can be put back into the reactor again and burned. So they feel that they have built and tested more than any other advanced reactor company. They're running a 30-day reactor experiment, 10 times less expensive. What they're doing is this plan. They're following building and testing designs with time, as opposed to the Americans who are waiting for NRC approval. They just do paper design for decades. And then finally, they think they'll do some testing, which they're talking about doing now, and they might get there eventually, and they might not. So he's trying to show how they have cut their costs by designing and improving more rapidly. These are some photographs. This is Tom Jan Peterson here talking with his colleagues. This is an image of his 100 megawatt unit that will fit on a truck.
Okay, that's not the same size as a South Korean 1 gigawatt unit. I mean, so comparing times is not quite equivalent, right? 100 million versus a 1 gigawatt and the time it takes to build them or put them on.
Are you sure you're talking 1 gigawatt? That's a hell of a lot.
Well, South Koreans are building 1 gigawatts, aren't they? What are they building?
I've never heard of gigawatt.
1,000 megawatts is 1 gigawatt. I mean, you're okay. So 1,000 megawatts versus 100. So you're talking 100-fold difference in size.
Yeah, but they're still using light water reactors in Korea, I believe.
Okay, but I'm saying
this wouldn't be at all the same. You just saw pictures. Well, let me go on. I'll show you pictures of this thing. This is their company, and this is a wide angle view of the company. So you're looking down in two directions down a single hallway at some of these people planning their operations. They've got 60 people. They have employees from 15 countries, 200 sub-suppliers. They've got 11 customers. They're making these pumps, saltwater pumps, and so on. They've been doing a cumulative component testing equivalent to 70 years. These are the systematic testing of small pumps. They're building more durable pumps. They're the old-fashioned ones up above. It's the most advanced loop lab tests currently available, high temperature molten salt pumps, and so on. So they're doing this sort of thing to be ready. Here they're doing equipment checks, various parts of the plant. They have 3 safety barriers here. This is a demonstration of the reactor and its safe levels of isolation from the public. This is another picture of their onion like molten salt reactor. Has 3 barriers they mentioned, not pressurized, and so on. I don't think you're comparing it to a gigawatt, but he does talk about going, to higher levels later. This is the reactor being tested. They don't have any thorium in it yet. They're just testing the salts for corrosion. I'm sure they're very well aware of what's going on at MIT. This is their 1 gigawatt power plant. Now, this is a power plant that makes these smaller subunits that fit onto trucks. So they have 1 gigawatt, but these are all components. Various companies might be buying 2 or 3 or 5 at a time, but the plant is presumably making one of these, so he thinks, every hour. So maybe he can ship 20 a day. When he looks at comparative marketing, he seems to be intrigued with the speed of development. So he has new builds on land with a low price of $20 per megawatt hour, market size 5,000 gigawatts. So you're way up to a high number there if you're talking about, I guess, a country or a large, vast company. And he thinks that if you retrofit, that's going to cost you a bit more. If you put it on a barge, he thinks that will cost you a bit more. And for some reason or other, ship propulsion, he thinks that's just way too expensive and never going to happen. But that's his view. He may be right in some of these, but certainly TerraPower, and this is the shipbuilding that you were talking about in Korea. They have subholdings with Hyundai, and they're doing various research and exchange with TerraPower. So that might be what you're referring to, Lou.
No, I was just talking about you said 4 to 5 years to build 1,000 megawatt reactor in South Korea. They probably have the best record of lowest time.
They do,
But
yeah.
Yeah, but they're building
There's a convention.
100 megawatt unit in a day. You said a day first, now you say an hour, but they can never build one of those in an hour. That's impossible.
I don't see how they could. Yeah, I agree with you.
But so you're talking at least a 10-fold difference in size. So you got to take that in consideration. That's all, a 10-fold difference in size.
Sure. Okay.
Even in a day, that's a huge feat to do.
It is, absolutely. And yeah, this is the number that I gave you in South Korea, that was for light water reactors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excuse me, could I ask a question?
Sure.
When you say that it takes a day to build the reactor, is that true? I thought the factory was going to produce one per day. And
Yes,
it takes much longer time to build it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we shouldn't be comparing these things.
I completely agree with you. Somewhere along the way in his stuff, it came out as 1 hour. Yeah, I don't believe it for a minute. I would be most surprised if he did it in a day, let alone 1 hour. Sometimes Jam is a little loose with his numbers. Sorry about that. I didn't mean for that to sneak into my slides. Somewhere it must have gotten in there. Or maybe I said it. Now this is their primary energy consumption predicted for 2060. Here we are in 2020. And what he's predicting is that thorium molten salt reactors will produce as much energy as natural gas did in this time between 1950 and 2000. You can see a nice piece of blue coming in there, and they're predicting the same sort of surge with thorium. This is after nuclear here, which is this yellow one here, orange one. Not done too well. Sort of crept in right there. And anyway, that's their dream, is that this is going to affect the world, the predictions, just as much as natural gas did. So what does the USA continue? Why does the USA continue to fail? I think it's fear based on public ignorance. There's fearful concern about waste accumulation. We chose to save dollars by not recycling our uranium. In retrospect, this was probably a serious mistake, as was ignoring thorium as a useful fuel. In future projections, our so-called waste is 98% unspent fuel, and so that can power most advanced reactors. Our radioactive spill meltdown problem is also a concern in the public mind, probably as a result of so many of us have been educated by The Simpsons. And so USA's only meltdown was at 3 Mile Island in '79. Nobody was affected by the small release of xenon, krypton, and iodine gas. It was compared with other sources of electricity. Nuclear fission in USA is by far the lowest mortality. So due to these fearful concerns, we've been held back dramatically as a country. And I think it's historically tragic that we discovered nuclear energy, applied it to atomic bombs, killed large numbers of people in 2 civilian cities. And maybe there's an underlying guilt, as some people predicted would happen from that. I'm not sure, but it sure has left us. We're a long way from seeing this in Congress. Somebody put this little joke up, and the president is saying, and fast track the development, testing, and certification of fully automated thorium-burning, liquid-fueled, load-following molten salt SMRs. I thought, well, that would be nice, but not so sure I expect it anytime soon. This is another piece of good news, a little earlier than the one I told you about corrosion. This is a development by the ANS, not by the DOE, but the ANS, which stands for American Nuclear Society. But they have set a standard for liquid fuel molten salt reactors, and that's new. They have a safety, they've designed or been asked to provide design criteria and functional performance requirements for liquid fuel molten salt reactors. That's pretty impressive. The design criteria enable the development of reasonable assurance that liquid fueled MSR plants are designed so they can be operated without undue risk to the public health and safety or to the environment. This standard defines safety objectives, MSR design criteria, and definitions of MSR terminology. If you read the literature on, or start digging into the literature on molten salt reactors, you come to, and that usually involves thorium, you come to two big problems. The first is the problem of corrosion, which I think has been not eliminated by any means, but it's still a problem. But some serious work has been done on it to reduce that as just so many writers, they don't do any research and to speak of, and so they just dispense with it and say, well, we'll never have that problem because there's too much corrosion. And the other one that they mention sometimes is an isotope of thallium. If you follow the degradation down the thorium pathway, it goes through thallium, which emits some gamma rays. And people have thought that it would be hard to protect the public not the public, but the workers in the plant. And so Jam has thought about that, and he's decided to have the plants run by robots entirely. And those robots will be outside the plant, monitoring everything that happens, but that at least they will not be exposed to the gamma rays of any thallium that comes into the plant. That is yet to be determined, and I'm sure has not lost sight of that. But that's the only other reaction. So those are the two negatives we have to date. And I think that Jam, for all his lack of concern about climate change, hopefully he has enough smarts to look after these two concerns. He will be a speaker next month in Texas at the there's a major Thorium Energy Alliance meeting in Abilene, Texas. They're going to have a tour of a local plant, but it's on April the 14th, and we still have this session going, so I will be unable to attend this year. But I'll be able to get some of the results from the talks, I'm sure, as a member, and so I'll keep you posted on that. Okay, we're probably just about finished here. Yeah, this book has come on, has a nice plug from Dr. James Hansen. It's called The 100% Solution. What is nice about the book is that it focuses on more than what we've been focusing on, which is this little thing with an atom on it here, and a wind turbine. It shows CO2 absorption. It shows some better farming. It shows improving the fuel in our airplanes. And so he tries to deal, instead of with just a 20% solution or even perhaps a bigger solution. What Bill Gates did say, and I reviewed his book with you, is that electricity generation and its immediate use in transportation are the low-hanging fruit. And as we've been discussing for the past year or two since we talked about Bill's book, we find the low-hanging fruit is not very easy. And we're still struggling. And then when we look at the not so low-hanging fruit, like farming, forestry, oceans, that's even tougher. And we've made very little progress there. So it turns out that these challenges are really serious ones. And at least this is a fairly upbeat book. I think probably more upbeat and less dreamy than this one, which I will now share with you as I stop to share. Unless anybody wants me to stay on this. Okay, I will show you now this book. And let's see if I can make that any bigger.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, okay. It's a pretty easy book. It says, "New nuclear is hot." And it's very compact. But it's inexpensive, and I recommend it. Probably more than the 100% Solution, but they're both good books. 100% Solution, I think, is a bit on the dreamy side, but I could be wrong. Well, you guys have been some good listeners, and I appreciate your comments. We've still got 20 minutes, so there's time for your questions. Now is a good time.
Could you just send out the names of those two books?
I will. Yep.
Thank you.
Richard, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
I've
I
got an
can.
unstable network here. Oh, yeah, okay. So on that 100% Solution book, what was their contention with farming, and what was their solution for the farming issue?
Well, we could review that. In fact, you're welcome to do that.
No, sorry, Richard, I don't have any desire to do that. I'm kind of more like Jam on my approach with the climate change bit. I think you probably know that. But at any rate, I just wanted to find out if it's the same thing that Europe is attacking their farmers with, in that they're saying that they can't use nitrogen fertilizers because it's harming the climate. And I just don't understand why they want to shut down all those farms in Europe. I mean, this is like insanity.
Well, our farmers are having a tough time as it is because the small family farm is rapidly disappearing and they're becoming giant corporations, and they're not gonna do anything to upset the
So,
political situation. So I'm not too worried about overregulation of farmers. I think that we do need to be careful about mega farms in the dairy industry because they're serious pollutants, not so much of our drinking water, although that could be a problem in the future. But Madison is built around this lovely lake called Lake Mendota, and it's getting pretty fouled and not getting any better because they're having difficulties with the farms upstream in the Hara watershed, and they're mega farms now. I don't think we need as much milk as we're producing. They apparently, when they get annoyed, the farmers, they just pour it down the drain because we do something that they find not palatable. So
But I mean, how are the farms hurting the climate? That's why I don't understand.
well, first of all, can I back up a second? Lee, how does nitrogen, other than making ammonia, pollute, cause CO2, other than making ammonia? I mean, is it?
well, the cows are belching vast amounts of methane.
Well,
And-
no, but growing crops in general, the cows don't have to be even in that. Is it the making
Vast
of the
majority of our-
ammonia?
Vast
Is it
majority
the
of our crop,
making of the ammonia, or is it the breakdown of the nitrogen fertilizers? Which one? I think it's the making, because if you make it from dirty hydrogen, that's not a good thing.
Deborah, you have your hand up. You want to handle that question, or do you want to make another comment, Deborah? I mean, Dorothy?
Um, I'm having to dig deep. I did review some sustainable agricultural practices, but because farming is not in my blood, a lot of that information has sort of evaporated after I tried to learn it. But there are a number of sustainable ways to do agriculture that are better for the soil, actually build the soil so that you can grow healthier crops on less land and eliminate erosion of the land. And also by carefully rotating animals and crops, you can use the animals to fertilize the land, moving them animals around like herd animals used to do. So there are a number of sustainable agricultural practices, and they can help gain a lot more ground cover that will absorb CO2 and will also provide nitrogen into the soil. So there's a lot of ways to improve agriculture so that it uses less water, so that less food is wasted, so that less gasoline is used to actually, run the machines and things of that sort. We don't necessarily have to totally give up. And I'm not really following the European controversy over farms. I'm just saying in general about agriculture. So it is a major source of the carbon pollution. A huge percentage, I think it may be 30%, is attributable along various links of the pipeline, I'll use that word, for agriculture.
Sure.
From growing it and transporting it, wasting it, and all those things. So there's a lot that can be done without closing down all the farms, just changing practices, maybe reverting to some practices that always used to work, and that as we became more mechanized and we became thinking more of mega farms, it seemed easier, to do away with these things. They seemed expensive at the time, but the expense is in not remediating the damage you do. And we have allowed corporations all over the world, not just in farming, to reap the benefits without ever repairing the damage that was done. So they're never paying the full cost of what it actually costs to produce something. They've just sort of passed on the reparations to somebody else.
Thank you very much, Dottie. I want to add to that, that we have a speaker next week by the name of Kurt Miney. He was going to talk about Aldo Leopold, and we've had a conversation recently, and he said that he would just as soon talk about community conservation and the reuse of the Badger Army ammunition plant lands in Sauk County. And that will relate a little bit to it because the experimental land farming research is on that land, and Allison Duff has spoken twice to us about advances in agriculture use, and I'd be happy to invite her to speak a third time. I realize you don't go back 10 years the way some of us do, Lou, and you may have missed Allison Duff in the past.
I think I did catch her. I think I
Yeah.
did. But
She would say very much what Dottie just said and have the data to go with it. We've discussed with her the possibility of using seaweed to cut back in the dairy
Yeah,
fuel.
yeah.
And I've not heard any serious attempts to try that. And that's a question I'm dying to put to Allison, and I might ask her to speak to us again this fall.
Right. But back to Dottie's point, Lee, you had a presentation on nitrogen fertilizers and nitrates, and you just can't get the scale built up with crops, the yielding by doing what you were saying, Dottie. The scale just doesn't go there. It's gonna drop considerably. Lee, you got to speak up because you had that talk, and I think that came through on that talk that you had on nitrogen fertilizers. Don't you recall it?
Yeah, but that's not been my focus here recently. It's just that what I'm not understanding is why Europe isn't maybe doing some of the things that Dottie's talking about and not just shutting people down. I just wondered what you guys were thinking, what your thoughts were about. To my point of view, that's just insanity what's happening over in Europe. And you know that they've got farmers protesting all over Europe about being shut down, having their farms shut down. So I throw the question back to you guys. Why in the world would do you think it's justifiable for climate change to
What are you,
farms down?
Lee, what are you saying farmers are actually protesting about in Europe?
Because they're shutting their farms down. They're
Okay,
telling them that they can't use fertilizer.
I want to stop for a second.
What?
Because I've heard you do this before. You make an accusation like this. There's nothing behind it other than what you're saying. So I want you to send me something that indicates why European farmers are protesting right now. Why they're protesting, other than you just saying it, okay? Please send me that.
I will.
I think that's the same situation in the Central Valley in California, when the money to be made is on almond production, and they're about to run out of water for that. It doesn't have any effect, but we're shutting down farms that have almonds. And how can you do it differently?
They're not, almond farms are being.
Climate change affects water much more for the agricultural situation than otherwise. And we're going to find when the Ogallala Reservoir runs dry, the whole Midwest, or at least a good fraction of the Midwest, is going to have terrible farming.
Well, you're talking about the Great Plains more than the Midwest, right around Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. We're not going to run out of water. We're not going to run out.
Go ahead.
The water is an issue, particularly all across the West, and water rights and water use are ever increasing problems as things get drier. And yes, you do have unusual events like this past inundating rains in California, but that's part of the climate scene where you're going to have extremes. You're going to go from floods to scorchingly dry periods, which is already happening in California. So water, I think, is an issue that's going to affect what kind of plants are grown and whether farms should be allowed on certain areas of land. Farms have spread in places in California where they never were before. Things like even the dams that were built to create hydroelectric power. One of the issues, and I'm trying to explore that a little bit, is farmers have used the water from the reservoirs to irrigate land that otherwise would never have been arable. And now that they're letting some of those impounded waters go, they're really very upset about the water. So farming is an issue politically, effects on the planet's effects back on the farms, not having water when you did have water. It'd be very distressing to have an industry that's going belly up because you can't get the water, regardless of whether you think they should have had their farm there in the first place. So there's going to be a lot of displacements of a lot of different people and a lot of different professions as we deal with climate change. And getting a public consensus is always going to be difficult. Somebody is going to be hurt. I think that's really what's going to happen. Somebody's going to feel it in their pocketbook.
I think that there are other avenues. Those are good points, Dottie. I think there are other avenues that are part of the high-hanging fruit, and one is just our personal preferences. Even Bill Gates mentioned it. He says, I'm going to have a hard time giving up my cheeseburgers. We all know that beef is a huge consumption of energy, of
Land.
grains and land. That's right, compared to chicken and pigs and fish, and yet we just hang on to our beef. And we had this wonderful speaker. She was really fun. Valerie Stoll, called Tiny Bites for Health in February, on eating insects and the quest for sustainable protein. I haven't started eating insects yet, but I'm going to one of these days. I'm going to try them out. Believe me, I've been having some fungus burgers lately. My wife doesn't like them, but I don't find them too bad. So we all need to deal with it at our personal level. We can't just blame the farmers. It's how we heat our homes. It's how we insulate. It's all kinds of things, and we can all work at a variety of levels. And we can sit here and talk about nuclear reactors. The benefit of nuclear reactors is that while it's a tiny little piece of the whole pie, it's as I look back at the history, it's so tragic in this country, especially where it was all invented. And I just find it both sickening to read it and heartening to see some of the myths being dispelled as they just did at MIT, so that we can start thinking of a mode to improve probably 100-fold the efficiency of our nuclear reactors. So that would be great, and reduce the costs accordingly. I'm not sure if JAM is going to be able to do it, but I'm sure, hoping that he and others like him will do so. So that's just a little tiny bit. But I'm concerned when I see all these power lines going through, let alone pipelines that could leak. This is bringing, I think, solar and wind energy. They want to export it, and it happens in Texas as well. Get a bad storm and it takes down all this stuff. If we had more small distributed reactors, we wouldn't have to have such a fragile grid to send the energy around.
That's true. There is the reactor, the higher temperature reactor process that does make green hydrogen, which would make fertilizer a lot cleaner. Ammonia-based fertilizers.
And steel production.
Process.
Steel production as well, Lou.
Yeah.
That would help tremendously. Well, it's 5 to 12. We did pretty well to fill out the 2 hours. Sorry, I
Richard,
got a little long, but it was.
Richard, one final question. France has a general approach to nuclear, which has been successful for 70 or 80 years.
Yeah.
And they did recycling. And is there you put in the fact that we made a strange decision not to do recycling because it would save money.
Yep.
On the other hand, we're spending money to deal with waste.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? What's the effect on the GNP over those years?
Well, I don't have those numbers, but it's a very good question to raise. And thank you for that. You know, France was in a little different position than we were back in the 70s. We just had long gas lines. We all probably remember waiting in these gas lines. In France, they didn't have the possibility of oil wells that they just knew they were not sitting on very many fossils, either coal or oil. And so de Gaulle, I think, and some of his lieutenants decided to do it. And the public didn't mind so much because even though they didn't invent the atomic bomb, we did have Curie, the discovery of radioactivity took place in Paris. We have the Curie Institute. We have a lot of other French people deeply involved in Becquerel and Siebert, all these people. So the French, they didn't develop the atomic bomb, but at least they understood from the beginning that they were pioneers in the concept of radioactivity. And so the French people didn't mind so much the idea. Why the Germans got the wrong idea, I don't know, unless they just realized that they didn't win. But somehow or other, the Green Party of Germany really dominates German politics, and the Green Party has really been a disaster where it's flourished in Europe. So it's but you're right. It's if you look at the situation now, when people thought back then, well, we suddenly realized there's more uranium than we thought around the world. We don't have to go to Africa to get it. We'll just get it out of Canada and places in Western United States, so we don't need to recycle. Yeah, that was really short-range thinking because they just kept kicking the can down the road decade after decade. Right.
Let's see, I had another question. Okay, you were talking about sodium-mediated reactors. So
Yep.
what is the physical configuration of the sodium in those reactors? I mean, are we talking about like pellets or what of like sodium metal or what?
Metal.
I think it's
It's
liquid
liquid
sodium.
metal. It's gotta be
Liquid metal, yeah. You can
It's
also
in
use
liquid,
lead.
it's in liquid form. Okay.
Yeah, you can also use lead. The Russians like lead better. They say that it's a nice eutectic with beryllium, I think. And so the Russians like that better. And they have powered some of their submarines, I think, and other vessels with lead, liquid lead. But sodium is the common one. I have a slide. I'm not sure if it's the one on the Rethinking Nuclear website. I think it might be, of all of the different experiments done with Gen 4 reactors. And the vast majority were done with sodium all over the world, some more successful than others. Japan did not have very much success, and France had somewhat limited success with sodium. But I think that I have high hopes for natrium, but it's good because it consumes the waste. But I think that the thorium is a better fuel than uranium, and not that much better as a solid metal. But when you put it into a molten salt mixture, then you get, I think, the safety and the efficiency of thorium comes through. So it's not the metal, the fuel per se of thorium. It's when you mix it with the machine of the molten salt reactor.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't
Yeah,
quite
of course.
answer your question, but
Yeah, anyways, yeah, sodium's kind of hard to handle because you don't want to get any moisture in there because you can have an explosion. That's probably why the Russians like to use
Lead.
lead
Yeah.
instead of sodium. Yeah, because it is, you have to really keep it under oil or something, you know what I mean, to keep the moisture away from it.
It's sort of funny, the history. Admiral Rickover was a student of Weinberg's. And so he really learned all about sodium and things like that from Weinberg. So years later, when Eisenhower directed him to, no, I got it wrong. Yeah. Anyway, when Rickover was told to build the Nautilus submarine, he of course went to Oak Ridge to get some advice, and he wanted to do a sodium reactor. And Weinberg said, "I don't think that's a very good idea, putting sodium in an underwater submarine."
Yeah, I can see a big explosion.
So he stuck to water, but later on, people, when Eisenhower asked Rickover to make a land-based unit rather than then think about using sodium, by that time he was so used to water moderated reactors that he said he just did that at the Pennsylvania reactor, and it worked well.
Mhm. Okay, thanks, Richard.
It's a pleasure. And I've enjoyed having you as an audience. Sorry about the interruptions at this end. I tried to minimize it, but my spouse, who usually does that for me, is out today. So I'm all alone and the phones were ringing all too much. But anyway, I want to remind you that we should have a good talk from Kurt Miney next Monday. And the next speakers are Terry Allendorf, Dottie Boatman, and then I'll talk about ocean perspectives in late April. So we've got some good talks lined up, and look forward to having you all in the audience. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Lots of information.
Indeed. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Pleasure.